To my YouTube channel. So now what we want to focus on is how to configure a DHCP on a router, right? So we have two options, right? So we can either configure a DHCP on this router, or you can configure DHCP on this server. So for now, I just want to take you through the steps of configuring a DHCP inside this router. So DHCP, as you all know, that it stands for Dynamic Host Configuration Protocol, and then it is the one that is mainly we rely on in terms of like issuing out IP addresses to devices in your network. So we have like two ways of assigning IP addresses, which is going to be your dynamic assigning of IP addresses, and then the second option will be your manual assigning of IP addresses, right? So manually assigning IP addresses is going to be you as the administrator manually assigning IP addresses to the device, right? So you assigning an IP address to that specific device. And then the second one will be you, let's say you create a range within the DHCP, and then you let the DHCP be the one that issue out IP addresses to all of the devices that we have in your network. For example, we have this laptop. So let's say your network consists of like maybe 500 or 100 100 devices in your network. You don't really have time like to go to each and every device and then assign IP addresses to those. And then here's another thing now. If you manually assign an IP address to a device, that IP address that you've assigned to that device manually, it doesn't change. It stays like that, right? So the device will keep that IP address. But what if now you don't have enough IP addresses in your range, right? So you don't want things like that. So manually assigning of IP addresses, we only leave it for, let's say, the devices that you know that the IP address mustn't change. For example, let's say you have a router. Let's say you have a router, the IP address, you want the IP address of your gateway to change, right? Manually assign it to it. And then also maybe, let's say if you have a server, maybe two servers, those two servers are the one that may be issuing out different resources to devices that you have in your network. So definitely those devices, you don't want the IP address to change, because the devices in your network, other end devices in your network, they will be always keep on communicating with that server using the IP address. Or maybe let's say you have a printer in your network, right? So that printer, you don't want the IP address of the printer to change. So if you manually assign the IP address to a printer, then that IP address stays like that. So that's that's what happens when you manually assign an IP address to a device, to any end device, right? The IP address doesn't change. And then dynamic. So when you dynamic is whereby we're using a DHCP. So you only create like a pool in the DHCP server, and then the DHCP server issues out IP addresses. But the thing with dynamic assigning of IP addresses, what it does is the DHCP lists IP addresses to devices. You find that maybe your device is being leased an IP address maybe for 7 days, or for 2 days, or for 3 days, depending on the settings or on your DHCP server, right? So when you come into the network the following day, you might see that your device is using a different IP address, because the IP addresses are issued out by the DHCP, and then it's dynamic. It doesn't stay like that on that IP address, right? Okay, so that is that's the thing about the DHCP, right? That's a bit of information about the DHCP. Okay, the other thing about the DHCP, so your device goes through what we call a DORA, right? The stages, right? Where the first one is discover, offer, request, and then acknowledge. So the discover part is whereby your device now sends out a broadcast message to all of the devices in your network asking for an IP address, right? Once you switch it on, or once you log into any network, when you have the password for any router, password for any Wi-Fi, password for any network that you are in. So the device, what it does is it sends out a discover message. It says, hey, I'm part of the network. I want an IP address. Who is the DHCP? Who's in charge of IP addresses in this network? And then the DHCP says, yeah, I am the one who's in charge of that, right? So because the DHCP is programmed to issue out IP addresses, once it receives that message, it knows, okay, this device is looking for an IP address, so he wants to talk to me, right? He wants an IP address from me. And then DHCP will say, okay, send out an offer message, right? Issue out an IP address. Says, okay, yay, I have an IP address, which is the message now coming from the DHCP. The first message coming from end device, it was a broadcast message, and then we said it's discover. And then the second one would be offer, coming from maybe 3 DHCPs that we have in our network. They're offering the IP addresses. It says, hey, I have an available IP addresses, right? And then all of the DHCP, if you have three DHCPs in your network, they might all respond with different IP addresses that they have in the network, right? And then now the end device will say, oh, okay, so I have so many, you have given me so many IP addresses, but I want to use this IP address. So he will respond with a unicast message. That message goes to the DHCP that he wants to use the IP address from, right? So the DHCP sends out, now the end device sends out what we call a request message, right? Saying, okay, I want to use this IP address. And then in the end, they're going to be like an acknowledged message. It says, okay, I've received that. And then the device now, it here's that IP address. And then it will go through something called the gratuitous IP address, whereby it checks if the IP address is used by any device in the network. So other steps. But basically, we go through the DORA. That stage is, right, whereby there's a broadcast, there's a unicast, broadcast. So it's different from Huawei. I looked at the Huawei material. The way they explained it is different, right, from the Cisco side of things. But basically, it's just a device asking for an IP address. And then any device that is programmed to be a DHCP server, it will respond. It's either the router in your network will respond with an IP address, or the DHCP server will respond with an IP address. So that's the concept about DHCP. So any device that is configured to be a DHCP server in this network, it will respond. So now what we want to do is we want to configure this router to be the DHCP server. But for now, I just want to copy the administrative commands. So if you missed my video when I was covering the administrative commands, please check out my video and then go through the administrative commands. I'll show you what I mean by administrative commands. So here are the commands that I have down here. We have enable, config t, hostname, AAAT. So all of these, banner, MOTD. So I just want to copy everything here. Even now this SSH part, right? Up to there. Right, let me just copy that. Okay, there's other one that I had spelling errors, synchronous. And the second one, synchro. SYNCHRONOUS. Is that how you spell logging? Oh, so it's supposed to be logging. Synchronous. Okay, so okay, let me correct that. Let me just copy this. I don't have time to type in this. What I want to show you now is how to configure DHCP. And okay, I don't want the interface. I want to end there, right? So copy, and then just go straight to my router. Straight to my router. There we go. Command line interface, and then say no. It's supposed to take me to user view mode, right? And then I say Control V. Oh, it doesn't want to Control V. Let me just say this and then paste it there. There it is, as you can see. So let me say do W. So a shortcut to save, or we can say and take you back. And then what you can do now is, let's say copy running startup config. So I'm copying the changes that I've made to this router to my hard drive, right? To the router hard drive. Okay, so now the other thing is, now I need an IP address for this interface, right? As you can see there is an interface, but it's down now. By default, this interface is down, so you have to switch it on using commands like no shutdown and stuff like that. So I want to assign an IP address to this. Remember, the main goal for this video is to configure DHCP, right? So let me say config t, and then inside the router, inside my router, let me say interface gig 0/0. So what I'm doing now, I just want to go inside this interface, right? And then assign this interface its own IP address. So the interfaces that we have in this router, they represent different networks. For example, this interface is under 192.168.10.0. And then the serial interface is under a 10.0.0.0.4. Sorry, I don't know how many zeros I've mentioned there. Okay, but anyway, there I'm inside the interface. How do I know that I'm inside the interface? As you can see, it says AAAT JHP config -if, right? Meaning I'm inside the interface. So what I can do is IP address 192.168.10.254.255.255.255.0. And then that's so you can see I use the last available IP address to assign to my router, right? There is no shut. So I'm trying to change. I've been calling a router. So people told me that no, I have to call it a router instead of router. So I'm trying my best to change from router to router. I'll get used soon. Okay, now we are already inside we've assigned interface. So let me show you how to check if you've managed to assign an interface to an IP address to an interface. So IP interface brief. You can see it says manually down. Where's gig 0/0? Okay, here's an IP address now, and then manual up, and then protocol up there. So it's fine. It is an IP address now. So we go back to config T, which is the global mode. Configure T terminal. Then, so we are in global mode. How do I know that I'm on global mode? As you can see, it says config there, right? And then now, if you're not sure about what's the next command to type in, you can use the question mark, right? And then IP question mark. Let's say I've forgotten how to configure DHCP. As you can see, I typed in IP and then there's the DHCP. So it says configure DHCP server and relay parameters, okay? And then IP DHCP, and then it says incomplete command. Let's say I'm not sure what's the next command now, question mark. We have options there, which is excluded address. So basically what happens is this part for excluded address, these are the addresses that we are going to manually assign to devices. For example, let's say you have like 10 devices that you want to manually assign IP addresses to. Then you can reserve the 10 IP addresses for those devices. So you can exclude them from the pool, right? So prevent DHCP from assigning certain addresses. So you want to keep those addresses for your printers, for your servers, and all of those devices that you are going to manually assign IP addresses to. So IP DHCP, let's say excluded address from, I want to exclude 192.168.10.1 up to 10, right? 192.168.10.10. So I'm excluding how many IP addresses? I'm excluding 10 IP addresses. But you can see this, we are not doing it inside the DHCP. As you can see here, we are still on global mode, right? IP DHCP, excluded IP, we inside the global mode. But now when we start assigning network range and all those things, we need to go inside the DHCP. So IP DHCP, let's do a question mark. What else do I have? So we have a pool, right? So now I want to say IP DHCP, and then the pool can be give it any pool name, right? So for example, let's say maybe this is for my branch in Johannesburg, or my branch in Pretoria or Cape Town, or maybe it's a flow. These IP addresses are for a certain flow in my branch in Pretoria. Then I can specify that IP DHCP, maybe let me say it's the HR department. Let's say I'm working for a big organization, right? Departments are big. So I have that IP DHCP pool, and then pool name is HR. As you can see now, it changes. It moves inside to the DHCP. So the minute I create a pool, it takes me inside the DHCP. As you can see, DHCP-config. So I'm inside the DHCP now. All right, what next? Let me see. IP DHCP pool. So we have to specify the network, right? Network, here's our network there. So we're telling this router that, okay, we're telling these devices that here's the network range, right? Network 192.168.10.0, 255.255.255.0. So that's our network. So we're saying to this router or to this DHCP that here is our range. So when you are starting to assign IP addresses, you are assigning from this range. But remember, we have excluded some IP addresses here at the top, right? We have excluded 10 IP addresses. So it's supposed to start from 11 somewhere there, right? Because 1 to 10 is already reserved, something like that. So we're going to see about that if this router will take that, if the DHCP will take that. Okay, network, and then now we need to assign. These devices need to know who's their default gateway, right? Who's their default router. So 192.168.10. What else do we have? Okay, the IP address of the router, right? I said I used the last available IP address to assign it to my router. Okay, and then the DNS. Do you want to configure DNS server? Say 192.168.10.1. That's my DNS server. Let me see if there's other configuration that I can run here. You see, we You have so many. So default router, there it is. DNS server, we've configured that. Domain name, if you want to configure domain name, you can do that. And then exit from the DHCP. Network, we've configured the network. Now, let's say I want to remove this IP address from the DNS server. I can type in no is for negating or removing the that command there, and then option row DHCP options, so you can type in all that information. But for now, what am I missing? I think I have all the information that I need now to run the DHCP, right? Okay, let me say exit, right? Exit, then copy, running configuration. So I'm copying the running configuration which are on RAM, right? On the router RAM, I want to copy them to what? To startup config file. Then they are copied, right? So let's test this. Okay, let me do this. Let me say show running config. Okay, can I show DHCP incomplete? Let me say show DHCP. I don't want to show the list though. Okay, show IP DHCP. What other information do I have? List. Okay, let me say show. Come on. Show running configuration. You will see all. So you can see down here IP DHCP pool, which is HR, the network, there's a network, and then default router, and then DNS server. There is, right? So now let me quickly show you. Let's go to any device. Click on that laptop, and then if you go to this desktop and go to IP configurations, check. We have an option for DHCP, which is if we have a DHCP in our network, then the DHCP is the one that's going to issue out an IP address of which we have configured a DHCP. Let's test and see if our DHCP is working. It can assign IP addresses, right? Click there, requesting IP address. You see, there is information. So 192.168.10.11. So you see, it started from 11 because we have excluded IP address number 1 up to 10. So that's how you configure this, the DHCP. So that's how it works. This is how it works, right? Starting from 11, you can see 192.168.10.254, which is the default gateway IP address, 10.1. And then let me do this. Let me ping. But since we received that IP address from DHCP, it means there is a connectivity between the two devices. So I want to ping the router 192.168.10.254. So there is the information coming through. So you can see reply from 192.168.10.254, which is the router replying to this device saying, okay, hey, I'm alive. Then we can start the three-way handshake, that communication. You can start communicating, things like that, right? So fine. This now a server. Remember, I said a server. We don't want the IP address to change, so you manually assign an IP address. So you go to desktop tab, and then look for IP configuration folder. That option there, and then static, which is now the administrator manually assigning the IP address to this device, 192.168.10.1. 192.168.10. The IP address of the default router, 192.168.10. Dot what? Or DNS server? Okay, he is the DNS server. So yeah, there it is. Fine, sorted, right? So this guy is now an IP address, right? He has an IP address. Let's ping that other PC. Ping 192.168.10.11. So you see, they can communicate, right? So he's replying. 192.168.10.11 is replying. Let's check this side. He doesn't have an IP address. So static, no. DHCP requesting IP address. Hi, who has an IP address? Hi, who's the DHCP in this network? And then the DHCP replies with an IP address .12. You can see, so it started with .11. Now it moved to .12. So that means now the next available IP address is a .13. So once it issues out, it takes out that IP address from the pool, and removes the IP address from the pool. So that's how this works, right? So this is how the IP or the DHCP works. So again, now the DHCP saves us a lot of work, right? It's a tedious work now to go to each and every device in your network and then assign them IP addresses. So if you have a system that can automatically assign IP addresses to devices, which is the DHCP, then we can rely on the DHCP to issue out IP addresses. So just configure one device, and then that one device will manage or facilitate the issuing out of IP addresses. As you can see, it also helps you out with avoiding the duplicate IP addresses from your network. Right, so it makes sure that if a 12 is already given to a device, then it removes that IP address from the pool, and then now starts from 13. If 13 is used, removes it from the pool. Think like that, right, going forward. So that's how the DHCP works, and then it saves you time. So okay guys, thank you for joining my video. If you have any questions, please drop your question there on the comments, and then see you on my next video. And on my next video, we're going to be looking at configuring the DHCP on a DHCP server, and then also configuring FTP and then SSH, things like that. Okay, SSH, we're done with SSH, but FTP, how to FTP to a server, how to download a file from a server, things like that. Okay, thank you guys. See you on my next video.